Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Adonia Simpson, and I direct policy and pro bono at the American Bar Association's Commission on Immigration. If you're not aware or familiar of the Commission directs the association's efforts to ensure the fair treatment and full due process rights for immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees within the United States. We are extremely thrilled to be presenting this incredibly timely webinar entitled What to Expect on Immigration in the 118th Congress, a bipartisan conversation with former congressional staffers. This event is being sponsored by the ABA Commission on Immigration, the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice, and the section on litigation with support of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so I really encourage you to follow us on social media to find out about more opportunities and to tune in. During today's program, we really encourage you to ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A. You should see a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. Please use that in lieu of the chat function. If you don't see the controls, please ensure that your screen is not on idle. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the program and do our best to address the questions in a timely manner as they come up and save some time at the end for some additional questions and discussion. We'll be sharing the recording of this program with everybody who's registered so that you can share it in your networks. So next, I want to introduce, we are honored to have AILA's AILA's Senior Director of Government Relations here today to moderate this panel and introduce our speakers. For those of you who do not know Greg Chen, he's overseen AILA's strategy and engagement on immigration advocacy and policy since 2010. Prior to joining AILA, Greg worked on international human rights and U.S. immigration policy for Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service and the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. He came to D.C. after representing children in immigration, juvenile delinquency, child welfare, and education matters at Legal Services for Children in San Francisco. Greg has also worked in civil rights field on racial discrimination and violence prevention on behalf of Asian Pacific Islander American communities in Boston and San Francisco. He's a graduate of Harvard College and NYU Law School and clerked for the Honorable Stephen Reinhardt of the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. Greg has testified before the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives and appears regularly in major print, media, and news broadcasts. We're so incredibly lucky to have him here today. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Greg to introduce today's panelists.
Thanks so much, Adonia, for that warm welcome and introduction. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today as we talk about this very exciting and important topic, given especially the things that are trending in the news right now on immigration. I'm joined today not only by Adonia, but also two truly seasoned experts in both immigration and congressional issues. Both are former Hill staffers. I'll start by introducing Monica Sankey and then Casey Higgins. So I've known Monica many years, primarily in the capacity that she did in working with the House Judiciary Committee on the Democratic side, drafting legislation on immigration and really serving as an expert on these issues. Monica has years of experience in the immigration field, having represented immigrants in proceedings in the southern border and also in teaching immigration law. She is also the daughter of refugees. And brings that insight and experience to her work. She is now currently the principal in Monica Sankey Strategies. It's a consulting group, and she works with businesses, Fortune 500 companies, philanthropic foundations, providing all sorts of guidance and expertise on folks that are interested in getting that guidance in the area of migration and global mobility. Casey Higgins is also somebody that I've had the opportunity to work with for a long time. Most recently on the Hill, she was the assistant to the Speaker for Policy and Trade as counsel in that position. The way I have known Casey was really her work on immigration issues, which was part of her portfolio. She played a key role in that capacity, which is one of the things she really brings to the discussion today, in seeing immigration through the lens of leadership on the Republican side as well. She spent over a decade working on the Hill, and is now a senior counsel at Akin Gump, a law firm. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into just introducing our overall topics, but this is really designed to be a conversation among the three of us. And we're going to divide up our discussion into two areas because there is so much that is going on in the next 2 or 3 weeks. We're going to start by talking about what we might see in the lame duck session. This overall panel is focused on what might happen in the 118th Congress that starts in January. So then we'll turn to that after we spend a little bit of time speculating on what might happen in the immediate few weeks. So the first thing I'm going to start with is to mention that we've had some changes recently in the Senate since actually we began developing this panel. A couple of recent things that have come up. One is that the Georgia Senate election was decided, where we now have Raphael Warnock getting reelected as the senator. So he will have a full term now coming up for 6 years. And before yesterday, that meant that the Democrats had actually 51 members to take control of the Senate. For those of you who haven't been tracking Twitter or news feeds in the past 24 hours, an interesting development has come up, which is that Senator Sinema of Arizona announced that she is shifting parties. She's going to switch parties from Democratic to independent. And so technically within the Senate, that means that the Democrats do not have the same level of majority, which is still extremely slim. She will continue to caucus as other independents do with the Democratic Party. But that will certainly change the political dynamics in the Senate. And I'm going to start by asking two questions. One is, Monica and Casey, if you have thoughts about how Sinema's announcement will change overall dynamics. And then let's just go right into kind of the heart of the question right now, which is, it's been reported that Senator Sinema and Tom Tillis, a Republican of North Carolina, are working on an immigration deal. And I'd love to just hear your comments on where that might take us. Maybe Monica, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you so much, Greg. I'll start by the announcement and to say that I do think that Senator Sinema's announcement shocked a lot of people. I think it was surprising. I've been reaching out to a lot of people on sort of in a variety of areas on the political side, and I think people were surprised by the announcement. And I don't think necessarily that they were surprised that Sinema has decided to become an independent. I think her ideology and her philosophies have very much always been that she's neither Republican nor Democrat. I've worked with her. I actually worked really closely with her office when she was on the House side. And then followed her staff a little bit when they moved over to the Senate. And I've been in her office, and there's some photos now where it's all painted purple, right? And the reason for that, and I mentioned, I was like, oh, is that your boss's favorite color, to the staffer? And he was like, no, it's purple because she believes her politics are neither Democrat nor Republican. They're purple. They're a blend of both. So I think substantively, ideologically, I don't think that there's a surprise in that way, because it sort of fits along with her individual thinking politically. I think the timing is, I think, what surprised everybody. She is in the middle of negotiating an immigration deal. Democrats have a majority. The timing, I think, is interesting. And I haven't quite landed, just to be totally frank, on what her motivations were, as far as why do it now? Why not wait till January? Why not do it earlier? Like, what's the motivation with the timing right now? So I do think that her decision is very much in line with her political philosophy overall. And so I'm not entirely surprised by that.
Casey, you want to jump in on that? Very interesting.
I actually don't. I'm going to completely leave it to Monica to analyze Senator Sinema's decision here as it relates to the Democratic Party. But I will jump in on what this means for the lame duck and her negotiations with Senator Tillis. And the short answer is we're still trying to find out. I mean, we as Monica said, we're all surprised to open up the Hill Rags this morning and see that Senator Sinema was now an independent. She'll still be caucusing with the Democrats. She hasn't completely flipped. So for those of you who don't know, as independents, there are a few of them in the Senate, you decide which party to caucus with. So the shift hasn't been entire. She didn't actually flip, but she has shifted away a little bit. So it doesn't change the dynamics drastically, but I would say we have been watching the Tillis and Sinema negotiation very closely. It's the only game in town right now in terms of a lame duck play on border and DACA, sort of where they're focused on. There are some separate conversations on ag guest worker legislation that really have not advanced far enough to be in contention for any sort of year-end package, is my opinion. And that's with Senators Crapo and Bennett. But this has actually, there's paper that's been produced. It's a 2-page sort of summary of, a meeting of the minds between the two of them. My understanding is that they're working on text, but it seems a little bit undeveloped to be prime for the fact that it is December 9th. I do think that Congress is going to be in session until the very bitter end of the month here because of the slow progress on a spending vehicle, as well as NDAA, which are two sort of must-pass things by the end of the year. So I think we're looking at it stretching to, end of December, maybe January 2nd, to be honest. But it still seems too undeveloped for me to be able to get the number of votes. I think there's a lot of interest on the Republican side in this framework, but at the same time, because the devil is in the details always with immigration, and there hasn't been text shared with any other members to my knowledge, I think it's really difficult to see how this comes together. This Sinema thing, to me, and again, I think we're all still trying to analyze it, but let me say they were looking at potentially doing a separate vehicle, right? So not riding along with a funding vehicle or on something else, but actually having a standalone vote on whatever the two of them could come up with. Again, it's undeveloped, and I think it's probably difficult to see how the Democrat leader allows a Sinema negotiated package to be put on the floor and sort of reward her on the heels of a decision like this. But again, I'm speaking out of school right now, coming from the Republican side, but as a former leadership staffer, I don't think that we would have been rushing to reward a member who had just left the party. So I think that especially makes this more challenging. The encouraging thing about this framework that they put out is that there is a lot of interest in it, and especially from the Republican side, people are open to it. They want to see what the text looks like, but there's openness. And on the Democrat side as well, I think nobody has really shot this down and said, no way in hell is this going. And there's talk, right? It's percolating. So, we're going to have a conversation about what this might mean for 2023. And it's not particularly uplifting conversation, I'm sure. But at the same time, I think when you work in immigration space and you've been waiting since 1986 for another overhaul, all progress is good progress. And I do see that you've had two very serious senators come together on a very reasonable compromise in theory. And I think that's a good step in the right direction.
Thanks so much, Casey. I'm going to take a quick effort at summarizing what has been announced and shared, mostly through leaked provisions of what's in the package, just so people have a ground level here. And then we're going to talk about things like viability and get Casey and Monica to prognosticate on what this might mean. So essentially, this package follows a framework that has been tried in the past, which is to marry the idea of legalizing a limited population of those who are undocumented in the United States with border and enforcement measures, with the idea that the two kind of main sides of this political issue each get something to benefit. But there are actually three elements to this package, the Sinema-Tillis bill. First is a legalization program, which is estimated in what has been shared only in bullet point form. I don't think anybody, or not very many people, have seen the actual text. It's estimated at benefiting up to about 2 million people. It's basically a subset of the dreamer population. It requires that you have been here in the United States since around 2018. And then there's an age limit cap in terms of when you would have to what age you've had to come here at the age of at least 18, that you would have arrived before you reach that age. It does not include protections for recipients of temporary protected status, which is something that was important to many people, but that's not included. There is a significant legal immigration component for more immigrant visas in the employer-based visa context. This would be visas for foreign workers, for businesses that are looking to fill those slots. The main element so far that we're aware of is something called recapture of visas. And what happens is that each year when there are delays in the processing, visas may go unused any given year. And this includes both employment-based and family-based visas. The existing statute allows some shifting of those visas between the categories. But essentially what happens is that if visas go unused, they are lost even though Congress authorized them. And there has been development of ideas to try to make sure those visas are not lost, but are made available each year. So this bill would accomplish that and is estimated to capture about 200,000 visas that otherwise would have been lost in the employment category. Family-based visas would not be provided here. The other main element is on the enforcement side, which is typically really focused on the border. And given where we are today on immigration politics, it's almost all in that space. This includes stiff, tough border security measures, including ramped up infrastructure, personnel, surveillance technology in the border regions, increases in Border Patrol agents, as well as port of entry officers to screen people coming in at ports of entry. It includes several measures that I will say make AILA very uncomfortable, but we are waiting to see what comes in the bill to understand what they're going to do. This includes processing centers in the border regions that would also expedite the timelines during which an asylum claim would be processed. It includes likely mandatory detention provisions for people that are coming in the border regions, probably those who come in between ports of entry, not at ports of entry, although we're not sure yet. It also includes what's been signaled as a lifetime ban on somebody who willfully fails to appear for their immigration court proceedings. I'll say that this could be incredibly severe. Well, it is definitely very severe to impose a lifetime ban, but it could be deeply unfair because the current system actually doesn't have adequate notice procedures. Many people don't know what is going to happen in court, but that's currently in there. There are going to be benefits to improve the asylum officer ranks to process these claims. There's going to be improvements to the digital technology to make sure that somebody who's processed by CBP and then ICE and then to the courts, that information can be more easily transferred, because that has often been where system breakdowns happen. So that is a quick sketch of what's in there. I'm going to stop and actually ask a quick question that came from the chat box, which is somebody asked, why these two senators are leading this process? Why Cinnamon? Why Tillis? Why not some of the other traditional members of both parties that have led on immigration? And then can you address the viability? What do we think? And Casey kind of revealed a little bit of her thinking with the fact that, hey, we're at already the 11th hour in this process, and it's still very much at a nascent stage. Maybe I'll give it to Monica first, then Casey.
Yeah, sure. As far as why these two senators, I don't really think that there is a good answer to that, other than these are the two senators that have, come together on a shared framework. They're both considered relative moderates, and I think that there's sort of a broad understanding that if you're going to get 60 votes in the Senate, the language has to be in the moderate space, right? It has to cater towards a moderate political persuasion. I will also say that, Tillis has been leaning in for several years now on immigration issues, a lot of it in the workforce space. And Sinema is motivated by, I don't want to say what she's motivated by, but it appears that she might be motivated by the fact that she's in a border state. She's in Arizona, and Sinema also has played a significant role in compromises and on other issues, bipartisan issues in the Senate these past 2 years. So she sort of I feel like she's taken it upon herself to bridge the two sides. And so I think that's part of why I think it's these two senators. And as far as viability goes, I definitely want to hear more from Casey as well, and Greg as well as you. I feel a sense of urgency. And I think one of the challenges, as Casey mentioned, right, we haven't had immigration reform since 1986. And every time an immigration bill comes up, there's always a sense of urgency, right? There's always a sense of urgency for the people impacted, for the economy, for the workforce. There's always a sense of urgency because our immigration system is broken. That's always a constant. What I think is new and different now is that we have a bad decision on DACA from Judge Hainan and the Fifth Circuit, and it's going back to Judge Hainan, and he is already shown that he is opposed to the DACA program. So we're in a situation where you have a judge who is likely to invalidate the DACA program, and he's likely to do that in the next 2 years. And when he does that in the next 2 years, the Congress will be controlled by Republicans in the House. And it is unlikely that House Republicans will pass any sort of legalization for Dreamers. So what is different about now, what's different about the urgency of the moment, is we risk having 600,000 young people. I don't know if you could even call them young people anymore, just people, right, who are going to lose work permits. And the devastation of that, right, the impact that could have, we're on the sort of precipice of that. So I am probably in the minority, admittedly, in that I feel, I wouldn't say optimistic, but I feel very strongly that the time is now. Because if we have a situation where we have all of these young people who lose work permits and are at risk of deportation, that is just, I mean, it's already a catastrophe, but it's going to be an exponential catastrophe. So I feel like there's viability only because, in my experience as a Hill staffer, things only get done at the last minute when people actually have to, when there's a severe consequence to be had. And in this case, there's that urgency, there's a consequence, something has to be done. And so I think I am, I'm not usually optimistic about anything relating to immigration, and certainly not immigration legislation, but I am optimistic because I feel the sense of urgency. And I do think that the urgency is felt on both sides of the aisle, and no one benefits, right? Like politically, it's no one benefits from, except for the extreme right would benefit, but nobody else benefits from not doing something right now.
Yeah, so I think, and I agree with Monica, I think what happened with the Fifth Circuit ruling, we expected that they were going to rule and it was going to get appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was going to say, okay, we're going to take up this case. And we thought we were looking at a June 2023 DACA decision. That gave us a lot of ability to go to the Hill, go to Republicans and say, okay, here, it's coming. And we know because of DAPA precedent, we know because of where Hainan is, we've got split circuits, we know what's going to happen in the Supreme Court. Really, no one doubts that it's going to get terminated. There are different iterations of how exactly that could play out, but it's going to be a problem, right? But obviously what the Fifth Circuit did was kick it back to the district courts, and it will still then go back to the Fifth Circuit, and we expect that it will still go back to the Supreme Court. It's actually probably going to be worse political timing now. It's probably going to be June of 2024 in the middle of a presidential election cycle, which is when nothing can get done on immigration, right? It's incredibly, or anything, right? Anything politically difficult. In middle of elections cycle is bad enough. We tried in 2018 and struggled. And this is a presidential election cycle, which makes it even worse. The problem, however, is that timeline is not certain. If we had a Supreme Court considering the case right now, we would know that decision was coming in June. But when I go to the Hill now and say, this is what's happening, it's probably going to be June 24, they're like, probably, but that urgency is not the same as it would have been if we had some certainty over when the Supreme Court was going to rule on this. So that has been problematic on the Republican side. I think the other thing that is making it difficult to reach bipartisan agreement, there are two other issues. The first is that, Democrats have had the ability to come to Republicans for the past 2 years and say, let's work on something on a bipartisan basis and get 60 votes and let, Speaker Pelosi move it through the Democrat-controlled House. Well, at the 11th hour, after trying to go through reconciliation, trying to fire the parliamentarian from the Republican perspective, trying to do all these things that were never going to happen, now at the last minute, they're coming to Republicans saying, we need to cut a deal, we need to do it now. And what's happening on the border makes that harder too, right? Republicans are looking at absolute record numbers along the southern border, and they are increasingly getting to the place where they don't feel the flexibility from their constituency to be able to do something on legalization without fixing the border first. Now, that is a very broad sweeping statement. I think that there are a lot of, and know that there are a lot of Republican senators that are absolutely willing to entertain some version of a border DACA, border dream deal like the one that Tillis and Sinema are working on. But again, the devil's in the details. And, I see all this back and forth in the chat, right? The devil's in the details with how you do these things. These are very complex, very difficult things to execute, but both sides have their constituencies speaking very loudly about what they want to happen. And I think that, those two, the fact that Democrats waited this long to try to strike a bipartisan compromise and instead tried to go at it alone, and the fact that the border is just getting increasingly worse with those crossing numbers. And I think it's just like at a fundamental level, I think Republicans see that a fundamental role of government is to manage the border, right? Like putting even security aside, like being able to manage it. And I think what they see is happening down there right now is not manageable, right? And it's a humanitarian crisis from their perspective as well. When you've got, 3-month-old face down in the desert, like there's a problem that we need to get our heads together and try to solve. And obviously we have very different ideas of how to solve those things. But all of this is complicating the ability to get to a deal. Regardless, I do think that Tillis and Sinema are onto something, but time is of the essence, and the clock is ticking, and I'm not certain with all the different variables right now that that there's enough time to get a deal together. If we had some more time, we might be able to do it, but we have a very hard stop of January 2nd. And there's a lot of work that goes into something like this. And usually, frankly, it falls apart 3 times before it comes together. And there has to be time for those things to fall apart. There has to be time to battle over every single word of that text. And when you've got, only 2 members who have seen the text that is not finalized, I mean, it's just from a pure process standpoint, it is very difficult. And then you add the very difficult politics of this issue on top of it, and it makes it even harder.
That sense of the time is ticking, Casey, I want to underscore what both you and Monica have stressed. The time is ticking on many of the DACA recipients right now. And as you both illuminated with your comments regarding what's happening with the court situation, challenging the DACA program, I think many people who are DACA recipients and also people that employ them are acutely aware of the risk to this population. And at least for the American Immigration Lawyers Association, that's one of the reasons we think it's so urgent that something get done now. And Monica kind of painted a little bit of the picture of what things will look like in the new Congress, essentially that it's going to be harder to get something done likely on immigration and protecting the DACA population. The other area of urgency, or the other kind of side of the equation, I think that speaks to urgency, is that our economy is still in recovery. And I think probably the most important issue affecting voters' decisions when they came to the polls just a few weeks ago is the fact that the economy is in a very difficult situation, and we've had inflation at extremely high rates for the past couple of years. There is language in the bill right now that, as I mentioned before, address the inadequate number of employment-based visas and the need to recapture them. Obviously, the DACA population, the DREAM population themselves, many of them are employed. How are you seeing that important constituency of American businesses and the needs of the American economy weighing into this immigration equation right now? Maybe Casey, why don't you start with that, and then Monica.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And look, the labor shortage issues are rampant right now. And I think every member of Congress, no matter where their district is, suburban or rural, they're hearing this from their constituents. Part of the problem on just broadly is that right now, the American people don't associate that labor shortage with a need for immigrants. So one thing that we need to be doing better is education, but also correlating those two, and doing more to combat some of the arguments from the far right that, you know, increased immigrant labor lowers American wages and things like that. We have those arguments. We know how to push back on that, but we need to be doing more in that space, and business needs to be doing more in that space. But it's incredibly difficult to execute in coordination more broadly, right? Like, this is just a difficult thing to do. We've always struggled to do it. Education on this issue is hard. And let me just say too, when my boss, as Greg mentioned, I work for Paul Ryan, and when he would go into a town hall, for him to walk his constituents through, from border security to guest worker programs, to the importance of immigrant labor from that perspective, to green cards, to fixing the, you know, doing legalization and how you do all of these things, which he was all supportive of, took him about 8 minutes. And that's actually a long time to hold people's attention, but also that just shows to me how complex this is, to be able to understand them enough to be confident in talking about it at a town hall, but also then, you know, being able to hold people's attention long enough to explain it. So the education piece, making sure that members know how to go talk about their constituents, is something that we need to be doing better, especially on the Republican side. And that will help with these things. I think that, you know, from the more high-skilled labor perspective, there's a lot of interesting things happening right now, particularly with the semiconductor industry on the tails of the passage of the CHIPS Act. You know, there's a conversation that we're going to have, and frankly, in the context of China, there's a provision that might be getting into the NDAA that would prohibit Chinese manufactured chips from being used in the US. That's only going to increase the need for us to have more chip production in the US. And in order to do that, we need more immigrant labor. And I think that members are understanding this. And I think they're starting to see in this context how actually having that immigrant labor is a national security issue. So the other thing that I think you're going to see business doing is trying to capitalize on different ways to help communicate this, to argue this, to make it understandable and compelling. So I think that there's going to be, you know, increased talk of that. But look, overall, we all need to do better about making these things correlate and pushing back on some of the rhetoric that you're getting from the far right.
Thanks, Casey. Monica, want to chime in on that?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think, honestly, I think the labor shortages in the workforce is one of our strongest arguments right now. I was reflecting that when I was on the Hill, so I think in 2017, 2018, I remember meeting with like large companies who were had benefited from Trump tax cuts, and they were saying, hey, you know, these tax cuts are fine, but really what we need are workers, right? And this was like 2018. So I do want to say that I think that the worker shortage is something that businesses have been struggling with for many years. I just think that COVID exacerbated it. And I do think that we're at a bit of an inflection point in our country. I think the CHIPS Plus bill is a really important point to underscore that that's a huge investment in the country. And are we going to have corresponding workers to be able to fulfill the intent of the bill? I will note that some of the original drafting of the CHIPS Plus bill actually had some immigration provisions, very minor, but some immigration provisions, and those were ultimately stripped out. And I think, you know, everybody has to get creative. I think the Biden administration's trying to get creative. I think their immigration staff are trying to come up with creative solutions, but at the end of the day, it is Congress's job to legislate on immigration law, to make the laws. And right now, that's been the bottleneck. And, you know, from my perspective, it's not a practical bottleneck. It is, I think you saw from the Trump administration a lot of fear of being, what is it going to be pro-immigrant? It's not necessarily rationally tied to the benefits, economic benefits and otherwise. So, I mean, what I'm hoping for, probably not going to happen for the next couple of years, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I'm hoping that we can, come to a place in immigration where we're all speaking from facts, from data, from some sort of common sense, some sort of rational place, as opposed to sort of some of the emotional rhetoric that we've seen for a very, very long time, and that I think we're going to kind of see for the future. I also just want to say that, we haven't named it, and I'm going to, is that we can't deny the impact that xenophobia has had, right, on immigration, which was ratcheted up by the Trump administration. And one of the things that I really worry about is that are we as a country going to continue to let xenophobia cloud our interests so much so that we're not actually doing what's good for the country? So we do fall behind on chips production. So we do put ourselves at a national security risk because we're so blinded by xenophobia. We saw that, like I said, for the Trump administration. I feel like we really have to sort of snap out of that. So I think we're really going to harm our country in the long run.
Thanks both for those thoughts. I'm going to shift us a little bit toward what is the other major thing that's going on right now, which is that we are seeing a lot of pressure on the administration to change its practices and policies because so much is happening in the border region. Before I get to that, I just do want to signal one thing. I think it's great to see we have a very lively chat going on. I hope people will contribute to that. It's great to see so many folks that are participating in the call today and taking part in the discussion. I do want to remind folks to pay attention a little bit to just keeping the discourse civil here. I think there's a lot of offhanded comments that are in here. I think that's good to keep it lively. But I would ask people to try to keep your comments civil and try to refrain from ad hominem attacks on individuals. Policies that are troubling are very much worth pointing out, but we should definitely keep this to a level that's focused in the policy context here. That being said, there is a lot happening in the border policy space that the Biden administration is focused on. In particular, we have a policy that is set to come to an end. Title 42 is a policy that was implemented under President Trump that was intended to block migrants, asylum seekers in particular, from being able to access the asylum program. It was very much criticized. AILA criticized this and opposed it as a policy and asked for it to be stopped because it was falsely justified. Title 42 is a health code. It was falsely justified as a measure to prevent the spread of COVID in the United States. As soon as it came out, science, medical professional community indicated that it was not based on any evidence, any fact-based information. It was challenged and it is set to sunset on December 21st. That has now ushered in all sorts of questions about what will happen in the border region and how will the Biden administration respond if there is an increase of people that would come to the border, given the likelihood that the Title 42 initiative will be halted as of that point. Would either of you care to just kind of offer your insights on what might be happening in the next coming weeks with the border management? Who wants to go first?
I'll let you take that one, Monica.
Okay, sorry, I saw something in the chat, but so I will say that when I was House Judiciary staffer, border issues were part of my portfolio, and so I've been following these issues very closely for a really long time. And I think my comment on the border issue more broadly, and as well as Title 42, is that we're in a global migration crisis. We're seeing global migration flows from, all around the world, which is hence the name global. And I think that one of the challenges is that I don't know of a border solution that we can implement domestically that will writ large and people fleeing to save their lives. I just don't think it's possible. Greg mentioned at the top of the hour that my father was a refugee. I'm happy to share a little bit. My father was expelled from Uganda in 1972. He went to a refugee camp in Naples, Italy. and spent some time there, and then was resettled as a refugee in New Orleans, Louisiana. I grew up in Louisiana. We were resettled by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, for which we are eternally grateful. I think about often that if that were to happen today in 2022, where would my family be, right? We would likely be in a refugee camp for 10, 20 years. At the end, you know, the desire to save your children and save yourself and find safety and protection is an innate human trait and an innate human value. And I think what's happening around the world with various governments, with climate change, as we're seeing in Latin America, is something that requires a whole world approach. Now, you're seeing the Biden administration do some of that, and they're trying to partner with countries in our hemisphere. But I will say that the idea, in my opinion, that any one policy is going to stop people from seeking safety for themselves and their children, in my experience, I think is unlikely to be successful. And so what I'm hoping more broadly is that we find a way not to keep people out, but to protect more people. And that's what I'm looking for in any sort of legislation or administrative policies. How can we work to protect people in their home country, as well as people who need safety in this country? I mean, it is a hallmark of the United States, our refugee policy. I worry that we're really betraying our values by having a security only, safety only approach. I think we have to think about how we can bring more people in as opposed to keep people out.
Yeah, the one other thing I would say on Title 42 as well is this is not a solution to the problem, right? I mean, and this came about because of the global pandemic. This wasn't, this wasn't a policy that was in place that, for more broader reasons, but now it's been here and it's been used. And now the question is, okay, how do we adjust, right? So I think that's a consideration we all need to make. As Monica said, there's no silver bullet here, but we need to figure out how to take this policy that's been in place and move on from it, because it's not appropriate in this current circumstance, and it's not the solution. So I think Republicans are looking past it as this is not the solution. We need to figure out what is, but there's concern about what will happen if it's just immediately pulled. And again, it's just part of this longer debate over how do we address what's going on, and we have a lot of different opinion over that. Can we come together and find compromise? Hopefully. But there's a long road to be able to do that. I do think this Tilla Cinema thing in some ways is the start of that compromise. But again, remember, it's likely not to go through, and it's an agreement between two members now that needs to be broadened to the point that you can find 60 votes.
Thanks to both of you. I'll make one other just comment here with respect to what's coming on the border policy. It was reported in the New York Times that the Biden administration is considering standing up a policy that has been referred to as the third country transit ban, which was something that President Trump had implemented, and then it was halted in the courts. It was only implemented, I'm not even sure if it was implemented in complete fashion because it was halted so quickly. It essentially required that asylum seekers who have transited, who have moved through another country before coming to the United States, that they seek asylum, seek protection in that other country. Otherwise, they would not have that eligibility here in the US. So it's deeply troubling. It's only been reported in the New York Times. The Biden administration has not announced itself that they might be considering reintroducing the travel ban. I'm sorry, the transit ban. My view here is that I guess I'll introduce two points. One is that we don't know what this looks like, so this is speculative. Any so-called transit ban that the Biden administration stands up would have to also pass muster in the courts, and there are at least two courts now that have struck down and joined the current one, and they would have to find a way to justify why this one is different. The Biden administration, I think, also takes a major risk, and as at least kind of Monica was flagging before about the deep problems with Title 42. The transit ban had the same, I would say, have the same problems with it. If the Biden administration were to stand those up, it's in a sense affiliating itself with an administration that I think is well recognized as having some of the harshest and most unfair immigration policies, and I don't think that would be a smart measure. Ayla is pushing against that provision while still asking that the Biden administration hold true and end Title 42. We're going to shift over now in the interest of time because we have about maybe 20 minutes of time when Casey, Monica, and I will talk, and then we're going to try to take more questions from the chat lines here. So I'm going to shift us back toward legislation. And in setting the stage for what's coming in the 118th Congress, can we just focus a moment on what might happen the next several days? We touch upon this briefly. So two questions, I'll be very specific. One is we've got the omnibus spending bill that has to happen before Congress can adjourn for the holidays to make sure the federal government is funded. That absolutely has to happen by December 16th, or they could kick the can down the road a little bit, but they will need to pick that up soon. How's that going to affect immigration? And then one question that's kind of been framed here is immigration is sometimes done in a concept of piecing together all the major elements in a comprehensive package. This package that we're talking about with Cinema Tillis is not quite that, but it has several elements. It's not just a single element that is sometimes referred to as piecemeal, but would either of you just care to address kind of what's happening immediate short term with the appropriations and this concept of dealing with something in a small bit versus a comprehensive package? Maybe Casey, go first.
Yeah, I want to say more broadly on comprehensive versus piecemeal. This is a debate we've been having for years. And there's no good answer, right? Like, and I've seen in the chat that there's a question about this, and there's a good argument for comprehensive. There is so much that needs to be fixed in our immigration system. And that's exactly what happens, right? If you're going to fix the border, you have to do something on DACA/DREAM, right? That's like the new one. But if you're going to do something on E-Verify, you have to fix the ag guest worker program. And if you're going to fix ag, how do you do that but not address H-2B? And if you're going to do that, how do you not address this? And it's this chain, right? And then everybody's like, if there's a moving vehicle, I want on it because I've been waiting since 1986 to get my issue fixed, and we need to jump on that. The problem is that so often it's been so much that every member has a reason to vote no instead of every member having a reason to vote yes. And it has collapsed under its own weight. And the argument that I have made, and I have written multiple pieces of legislation legalizing 12 million people, right? Like I am very much in the pro-immigration camp. But the argument I have made is that if we can't step back and try to do something that's not comprehensive so that it doesn't collapse under its own weight, but instead take steps in the right direction to do confidence building measures that show that we are not completely inept, we being Congress. We can do this without the political ramifications burning the place down, right? Our bases won't lose their minds. They will see that we are making progress and that things are improving, and we can build the confidence to be able to do more and more. And I honestly believe, after watching, in 2013 and 2014, I drafted the bill that was supposed to respond to what the Senate did. And we couldn't get there because of the heaviness of that. So in 2018, we came back and we said, can we offer something, before we thought the Supreme Court was going to rule on DACA again, that we can get House Republicans around, sent to the Senate? And it wasn't comprehensive, right? It did border, it did Dreamers, and it did and it was DACA, but it did that, and then it did some ag guest worker, and we couldn't even get 218 Republicans around that, right? So from my perspective, what we need to be able to do is start putting these pieces together, pair them together, do confidence building votes, and show that we can do this, and it's okay, and we won't, the political world won't burn, and then be able to do more and more. So from my perspective, I agree, like we need to do comprehensive reform, but we can't do it in one big package. I don't believe that, politically, and where Congress is now and will be for a long time, that's a feasible way for us to do this anymore. Monica, I don't know if you agree, but that's certainly my opinion after watching for the last 12 years how this has played out.
Yeah, no, actually, I do agree with that. I think that my concern, and I know we're going to get there, right, is just that in the near future, in the next 2 years, I don't think, and we're going to talk about this, I don't want to jump the gun a little bit, but with Republicans in control with the House, particularly with the nature of the House Republican caucus, I don't believe that even a piecemeal, even a small provision can pass. Now, obviously, we're going to get to that. But I think that we're up against. I think our backs are up against a wall, and I think the question is, given that we're facing a 118th Congress, many of whom have sort of extreme right-wing views. In my opinion, that increases the urgency to kind of, as you were saying, Casey, get something done now, because the prospects for the next 2 years are unlikely. So I think there's sort of two questions, like what can we do now? What can we do in 2 years? And then a third, what after the 2 years, which I don't think anybody would even attempt to guess what 2026 would be like.
Right.
Well, why don't we go there, since Monica's teeing up the question. So things might change just a tad bit in the new year. We know they will change in the House leadership, with Kevin McCarthy presumed to ascend to become our new House Speaker on the Republican side. The Democrats will retain control on the Democratic side with a very slim majority. I'm just going to throw the question out there. How will those leadership changes impact, and Monica, you've already kind of shared, so I'm going to go with you first. How's that going to impact our chances of getting small or big, piecemeal or comprehensive done for immigration in the new Congress?
Well, I really want to hear from Casey and from her experience working in Paul Ryan's office. But I will just say that, I think a couple of things, right? So we have a Democratic president, we have a Democratic Senate with a very narrow majority, and a Republican House also with a narrow majority, right? So when you're looking at, strategy and where you need to align yourself, it is still true that neither party has a significant majority in either chamber, right? So that's what that also means is that because there's such a narrow majority in both the House and the Senate, with the Republicans controlling the House and the Democrats controlling the Senate, a few unruly members on either side of the equation, either on the Senate or on the House, can really muck things up, and it makes it really challenging. And again, I want to hear from Casey on this. And I think that I do want to say that in the House in particular, I also want to just name that I do think that the attack on the Capitol on January 6th really sort of, and then the subsequent vote to not certify is still lingers in the ether in the House. And so when you're thinking about bipartisan issues, there is a lingering distrust as well, I think, between both parties. And I just want to name that when you're thinking about how to push legislation or how to work together, we're not just thinking about immigration, right? These members work together on a variety of issues, and there is sort of some historical distrust for a variety of reasons that are not immigration, right? Legislators don't come together in a bubble, right? There's many issues that they work on. And I do think that, the particular challenge of the House and the next Congress is colored by a lot of factors that are not necessarily always related to immigration.
Yeah, I'm just going to start there. I think Monica's 100% correct. The relationships between the two parties in the House in particular have never been worse than they are right now. And it's January 6th. It's also the pandemic, right? Members weren't there. They weren't in the same building. They weren't working together as frequently as they had been in the past, right? Committee hearings were remote. So you don't get in the same room. You don't walk to your spot on the dais and pass a Republican and say, hey, you know what, I've been meaning to talk to you. I saw these comments you made, and I think we can work together on this issue, right? Like none of those things happen. In fact, staff aren't together in the same way, and that's a problem. I think staff have always worked. In fact, Monica's colleague, David Shahulian, and I worked, we were on the phone every day for years, basically. So staff, we work well across the aisle. So I think that the pandemic had an impact on that. January 6th certainly did. And relationships in the House right now between the two parties it's as low as I think it's ever been. And I think, we just need to pray that that gets better, because it's certainly not a way for us to govern. But, and look, there's a lot more that goes into that, as Monica said, beyond immigration. So I'm going to pull back to what's going to happen in the House and how this impacts immigration. So look, I do think right now Kevin McCarthy is still going to become speaker. That is up in the air, but I don't think it truly matters who the speaker is. I think the circumstances are going to be the same, right? You've got a very, very slim majority. As I mentioned earlier, there's a ton of frustration with the Republican base and with Republican legislators about what's going on at the border. There's a ton of frustration with Secretary Mayorkas coming in to testify and saying that the border is secure. They don't believe that. They're down there, they see what's happening, and Republican legislators simply do not believe that. So, they're going to be investigating what is happening at the Department of Homeland Security as it pertains to this. Obviously, there's been personnel changes within the agency as well. They're going to be looking into that, and they have laid out a very clear border first agenda. Kevin McCarthy has been clear that he is not going to do a border for any sort of legalization trade. But I think this all sounds awful, right? Putting this aside, I think that there's a very good reason for him not wanting to do this. And that's because there's no Republican solution on immigration, right? There is no solution that gets 218 votes in the House without Democrats. There is no solution in the Senate that would get 60, if you had 60, there is no Republican only solution. When you move into the middle, you lose the end, right? What am I saying? I'm saying that any immigration solution has to be bipartisan. It has to be. It's, even in the House, we cannot do this with only, 218 votes. Why didn't Speaker Pelosi move comprehensive immigration legislation? Why? The votes aren't there. I don't think you can do it on the Democrat side either, right? The Republicans can move some border stuff, and that can get 218 votes. The Democrats could move DREAM, and that could get 218 votes. Painfully, right? Like it took some back and forth to get there. But my point is, it has to be bipartisan. This Tillis Cinema conversation is so important because it's bipartisan, because it's two moderate members coming together to say, I acknowledge there's a problem on the border. We acknowledge that we need to do the right thing for the DACA recipients and beyond, right? We haven't touched this since 2012, just because, we need to move the dates, in other words, and we need to make sure that this is available to more people who are in this situation. You have those acknowledgements happening. That's important. So the difficulty the next 2 years is that Kevin McCarthy has such a slim majority, and you're going to get ousted, frankly, if you try to cut a deal on immigration right now. But as Monica alluded to before, what forces compromise? Something happens that forces it. Congress loves a deadline. They never move on anything until it's, the cliff. How many times have we talked about the fiscal cliff or this deadline or that deadline? In 2018, we thought maybe the Supreme Court was going to take up the DACA case, skip the lower courts and take it up. And they declined to do so. But that concern made us move, right? We started putting immigration legislation on the floor. It all failed again because Democrats didn't want to work with us on it. And we can't get to 18, but that was the impetus for action. I think that there is a world in which, as this DACA case approaches, as the border becomes more unruly, like there is at some point going to be an inflection point here that both sides have to come together and they have to do something, because there's overwhelming political pressure saying this must be done. And I am praying that it does not take, visual of DACA kids being deported to force that to happen. But we are very much at the point that I think we are waiting for a crisis point. and that will prompt action, and it will be border DACA action, right? Those are the things that it will be. The last thing I would say is there's been a lot of talk about a Band-Aid right now on DACA, right? And it's not legalization, but it extends the program to avoid that Supreme Court hitting and just pulling the rug from out under these people. There is everyone I've talked to, corporate clients, whoever it might be, they hate this, right? They're like, no way, we cannot do this. We cannot use them as pawns. The sad reality of the situation right now, and I completely agree with that, but the sad reality is that we don't have an alternative at this point. So I think it's important for people to remember that we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to immigration right now. If it's not like the perfect solution, we're going to have to come back and do more, but we're going to have to take what we can get when that crisis point hits and make sure we're ready for it by doing the education in advance and things like that. I mean, there's always work to be done to prepare for these moments, but the moment's going to come. It's not going to be pretty when it does. And, I think we just need to be prepared to accept the political reality that, the perfect product will not arise. And we need to just encourage the Tillises and the cinemas of the world to keep working towards getting us to that point.
One point that you made, Casey, about the urgency on DACA, I think that crisis point you're referring to will become more severe. It's hard to think or hard to accept that right now that urgency isn't already being felt enough for Congress to act. I am still hopeful that we will be able to see a package that parties can agree to in the next week or two. But that point you're making, that if the court then rules against DACA in the next year or two, that crisis point, I think, when people really see the possibility and possibly even DACA recipients being deported and subject to removal, I think that could prompt the urgent action that for some reason hasn't been able to come yet. So I think that's maybe among the few things that weigh on the positive side of what might force immigration to get done. I think that's in there. To turn back a little bit to the darker side, again, you both spoke about how challenging the setting is right now in terms of polarization. Kevin McCarthy has indicated already interest in impeachment proceedings against Secretary of Homeland Security Ali Mayorkas. Maybe this is just to prompt the obvious, but how do you think that's going to impact, I guess let's put it in two ways, both viability of coming together on any kind of bill, any kind of reform, and then what might it actually do on immigration with respect to how the Biden administration handles it?
Yeah, so on the Mayorkas thing, I think McCarthy has chosen his words very carefully. I don't think he has explicitly said that he will allow impeachment proceedings to go forward. Look, and I think there is a lot of pressure on the Republican side right now to impeach Biden, for example. And I'm not saying that is, realistic or something we should be doing, but I think that there is a lot of frustration with the Biden administration. And, coming off the heels of the Trump impeachments and things like that, people know the word impeachment and that's flying out of their mouth left and right. So, focusing on Mayorkas is obviously something that they're going to do from an oversight perspective. I think that McCarthy's goal is to be able to do the investigations well and make sure that if there is something there, then okay, we can have a conversation about impeachment, but let's not rush to impeachment, right? We need to actually do the investigation and see if there is something there. And I don't know if there's something there, right? But I do think that he's open to it, and we'll see what that investigation yields and go from there. More broadly, again, I think that there's a world in which the national security implications of things like high-skilled visas for the semiconductor industry is something that we're going to be able to have a conversation about next Congress. There are things that ride on the appropriations vehicles and always have. So EB-5 is one program that recently was had for years ridden in the appropriations vehicle and was reauthorized and separated from that vehicle. But currently, Conrad 30 is still there. There's H-2B language that rides in there. e-verify authorization. But I think, with things like H-2B, that's an ongoing conversation that I think we're going to be able to keep having. It's still incredibly difficult, and the Republicans are still going to be saying border first, border only, border. But I do think that there's going to be some room to try to do some very small gains on this front. And I mean small, right? Until the moment hits where they decide they need to get together and fix the DACA program. And again, that will be the first crisis point, I truly believe. I think there's room for small things. Like, frankly, when I was in the Speaker's office, we moved the Kiwi Act, which was a very small bill allowing New Zealand to get access to E2 visas. But again, it was confidence building, and it took some work for us to get our side to agree to allow this bill to go, but it went under suspension of the rules in the House, which means 2/3, and by unanimous consent in the Senate. We also moved a bill, Irish visa bill, that moved under suspension in the House and nearly passed the Senate, but for one senator that would not remove his objection. Other than that, we cleared the holds. I believe there were another couple cats and dogs. The bill on per country caps, now known as the Eagle Act, is one that, for political reasons this week, did not move, but has always had broad consensus. That is a very, that bill has come under a lot of separate scrutiny, but I do think that there are little things like that. I use it just to say it's not a big overhaul. It's not what a lot of people want to see, but those are the kinds of things that you might be able to get some traction on, or if your clients are interested in them in the next Congress. It's going to be little pieces like that, I think.
Monica?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one thing I wanted to just sort of piggyback or just kind of go back to is that cliff that we were talking about, right? The image of DACA recipients, being deported. I think, again, I just want to underscore back again is that I am not confident that if that happens when the Republicans in the next 2 years, the House is controlled by Republicans, that we'll get any sort of relief during that period of time. And so I think that, to go back to my comments previously, the reason why the moment right now is so urgent is because I don't think there's anything that the Republicans would agree to. Because I think so. I think that's why it's so urgent. I really like that the phrase that McCarthy's immigration policy is going to be border first. I think that's a kind of a really concise way of talking about what we're going to see from the Republicans. And remember, it's not just going to be, traditionally the House Judiciary Committee, which is traditionally where, has authority on oversight over immigration issues. I think you're going to see it across committees. I think you're going to see House Oversight. I think you're going to see House Homeland. I think you could possibly see some sort of select committee. I do think that when we're going to be addressing immigration issues in the next Congress and in the House, it's going to be, to throw a number out there, sort of 90% or maybe 80% border, 10% fraud, and then 10%, I'm not sure what else. And so I think that it's going to be really hard with that framing to push anything, I think, on DACA. As far as the small things go, this is where I'm even pessimistic, to be honest with you, about even the small pieces of immigration legislation moving out of the particular House. I think that what my worry is that anything coming out of the House in the next Congress is going to have poison pills attached to it. And that I guess could be stripped out by a Democratic Senate and pushed back down. I mean, that could be what we see, the sort of ping pong effect. But I do think that some of those poison pills will happen. The one thing I wanted to just sort of talk about, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead here, Greg, is that the dynamic of, again, a Democratic president in the middle of his administration, a Democratic Senate, and a Republican-controlled House in the beginning of, unfortunately, what is a presidential campaign season, which is crazy that we're already thinking about another presidential campaign. It feels like we just finished them. Is that what you're going to see out of the House is going to be a lot of message bills, a lot of message hearings, a lot of framing of immigration primarily, again, not just in a border security context, but also in a context of highlighting fraud. And a lot of the message is going to be, and it's going to be narrowed to the point of highlighting that the Biden administration is incompetent in its administration of immigration. Now, whether that be at USCIS, CBP, ICE, state, you're going to see it across the board. It's going to be methodical. And across the board, it's going to be pointing out that the Biden administration has failed in immigration writ large. Because what is going to happen too is the House is not just trying to paint the Biden administration as incompetent. They're also trying to say this is why we should be in power, because our ideas are better. But in order to prove that, they're going to have to sort of slowly and systematically take down the Biden administration. And I say that because I saw it happen repeatedly when I was in the House minority. And at that time, yes, there was a lot of talk on border, but it was also on USCIS. It was also asylum fraud. It was also EOIR immigration courts. And so you're going to see it sort of systematically across the board. And one of the reasons why that's particularly challenging is that the Biden administration is only in the middle of the administration. They're not wrong necessarily that there are just so many systemic problems across the board on immigration, but that I would agree that I would just make the point that I don't necessarily always think that the solutions that are going to be proposed by the House Republicans in the next 2 years are going to be ones that are efficient. It is going to be a lot about messaging as the Biden administration as incompetent. I think that's really important because when I was in Congress, there was a lot of, let's not worry about what happens in these committees. It's just messaging. And I'm hoping that people who care about immigration issues more broadly can really pay attention to what is going to come out in the next Congress, in part because those are ideas that are often seeded in those committees that are then implemented in future administrations. I saw that when I was on the House Judiciary Committee. A lot of those ideas were seeded then into the Trump administration, and the same is true for Senate Judiciary. Stephen Miller and Gene Hamilton both were staffers on Senate Judiciary. So I think what I'm saying more broadly is that, yes, I think unfortunately I'm not optimistic about anything happening on immigration in the next 2 years. And also I think that we need to be really careful to make sure that things don't get worse by message bills and hearings that are motivated by nativism and the anti-immigrant right, and not motivated by ideas that are intended to make our country a more economically secure and more humane.
I'm going to pick up a couple of points that you flagged, Monica, that have come up in the chat and the question and answer. One is Monica was using the term message bills. And so just so the audience understands what that means, a little bit of a Hill jargon. A message bill is basically a bill that's designed to send a message. And the contrasting point is that it's not necessarily intended to actually win passage and become law. And whoever's proposing it doesn't intend for that, but they want it for another purpose. And typically that message is for a political purpose. In this case, I think Monica was talking about the idea that it would help for the elections coming up in 2024, rather than try to make good policy, make good law on it. And there was a question in here about, what is the way to try to incentivize both parties to try to actually reach an agreement on immigration. So I'll throw that question out to either one of you. If you think there's a way that we can try to shake up the politics and the dynamics. I think you've already been addressing it quite a bit here, but is there any magic potion that you could throw across the Capitol to incentivize compromise here? Just smiles and silence.
I'll just answer one thing, and then I'll kick it over to Casey. But I will say that I've been looking a lot at the issues that the United States are facing on immigration are not unique to just the United States, right? We've seen these similar challenges all over Europe, right? Where we have aging populations and not enough workers. And so where I believe ultimately we're going to get change is, I really feel like it's going to be motivated by economic necessity. And I am just hopeful that we don't get to a point where, we're really sort of down in the dumps, and I'm hoping that people can be positive. But I think if you look at other countries who've been resistant to immigration reform, and you look at the United States, it's almost always motivated by economic necessity.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that. It's so hard, right? I mean, and it has become even more polarized I mean, look, where we were in terms of compromise in 2013 and 2014 and where the two parties were, we were so much closer together then. Yes, Donald Trump moved Republicans to the right, but I would argue that Democrats have moved to the left as well. And every year, right, we get further and further apart, and it's just really difficult because we are so not on the same page right now. And that's why I honestly believe that part of this is starting with piecemeal and starting small and being able to work together, build confidence that we can find compromises that our respective parties, will allow to move forward. And we've got to find a way to get back on the same page. But I would also say that I think this is indicative of a broader issue in our country right now, and the divisiveness of politics, where we can't talk to our neighbor because they're of a different political party. It used to be that our political party was not our identity, and it didn't make us necessarily a bad person, and it didn't make us necessarily a racist, and it didn't necessarily make us all of these things, right? And we could disagree on policy substance. We're very much moving away from that right now. And I think as a country, we have to find our way back. And I think immigration is one of the biggest victims of that divisiveness, because it's the issue that both sides have just, gone separate ways on, and it makes it hard to find a path forward. But I do think Monica's right. I think that we're gonna hit a point here where everyone's looking at our place in the global economy as well, and looking at China, which is a massive increasing threat and very scary on multiple levels, and saying, what do we have to do to remain competitive? And how do we remain free, right? In this global economy where things are changing quickly, what do we need to do here? And I do think that may be the point where we can finally start having a conversation. And look, I think the beginnings of it are happening. Chips, STEM visas is probably not a super sexy issue, and it's probably not what most of you want to hear us talk about. But I do think there's the beginnings of that there, right? Where you're looking at immigration as a national security issue. And you're saying that the strength of our country, not just economically, but our beliefs in freedom and things like that, all of these things go back to the fact that we're a nation of immigrants, and that's important, and that's to be valued, and we should be looking at it that way. We need to get back to that mindset, and I'm hopeful that we can start trending in that way. But we'll see. We have a long way to go.
In the interest of that question on getting maybe smaller things done, there have been several questions that have come up about the Afghan Adjustment Act, which certainly was at a highly compelling stage a little more than a year ago when the evacuation happened. I think there was a huge amount of interest and concern, recognition for the needs of the Afghan population, and the U.S. commitment to that country and to people that are fleeing from the regime there. But I think the momentum that was initially there in the fall has dissipated somewhat, both from attention from the American public and in Congress. But there is bipartisan support for the Afghan Adjustment Act. We've got several Republicans and Democrats that are now sponsoring it. Care to comment on what its chances might be in the short term, because there is an effort right now to get something done with the omnibus appropriations bill coming up, or in the new Congress? Who wants to go first?
I don't think Republicans and Democrats are on the same page. I think that there is a compromise to be had here, but I don't think that they're getting close to it. And I honestly think there is lingering frustration with the pullout in Afghanistan and how it happened. And very politically, Republicans are not looking to bail the Biden administration out of this problem. I also think, and one of the things I keep hearing is that we should have been dealing with this in advance of the pullout, right? We should have been planning for this. 100% the Trump administration stopped or very, very deliberately and ground to a halt or slowed at least the SIV processing, the special immigrant visas. But it wasn't quickly picked up and expedited. There's frustration that those weren't pushed through by the Biden administration before the pullout. So there is a much broader dispute and frustration between the two parties right now, and this is falling victim to that. But I do believe that there's a compromise that can be had here, but the conversations are not productive towards that. Is my understanding of the current scenario.
Casey, it sounds like from your viewpoint, it's mostly kind of a big picture political issue, which I don't disagree with that assessment. But are there other...
And I would say too, Greg, I think this is on a lot of issues right now. What I keep hearing Republicans saying is that Democrats for 2 years would not talk to us on anything immigration, right? And they were trying to go through reconciliation and fire the parliamentarian. They did not talk to us. And then at the last minute, they've come to us on all of these things to try to get us to support what they want, but they're also not trying to negotiate with us. And it's not my way or the highway. If you need our votes, we've got to get in a room and negotiate. And Republicans do not believe that Democrats are actually opening the door to a legitimate negotiation on this, but on multiple fronts as well.
Monica, you want to take a stab on that?
And I do want to add that I think, kind of to Casey's point previously about where the parties were and where we are now, the Afghan SIV issue was historically a very bipartisan issue or nonpartisan, right? When I was on the House, it was one of the very few issues that we worked really closely with Republicans on, and there was broad agreement, in part because, as Casey's alluded to several times, it's a national security issue, right? Whenever our forces are abroad, we have to make sure that the people who help our military are protected. Otherwise, we're really, risking our troops in the future. And so I think that just from a global standpoint, if you see where we are now, it's also, I think, a reflection of how far we've come more broadly. I will say that I just want to echo again, maybe the same thing, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I do think that the time is now to get something done. I don't think it's going to be possible in the next 2 years. And again, on this issue as well. And I think all of the same points are true, right? We can't risk a situation where we're not providing protections to the Afghan population in the long term, kicking the can. And I would say more broadly, while I think it's really wonderful that the Biden administration has offered parole to so many people who need it, not addressing the issue right now is, as we've seen in immigration, you're just kicking the can, that problem, in the future. And again, we know that can is going to be kicked 2 years. And so what are we going to do right now? We have no idea what our future will hold. And if we have a situation where the world perceives that we didn't protect those that helped us, no one wins. It's just not a good situation. And so what I've been hearing is there, kind of like everything else, is there something that can happen to help Afghans that's perhaps less than the Afghan Adjustment Act? I don't know the answer to that, but again, I would just hope that there's urgency, because it's really important for our country.
I'll make a substantive policy comment on the Afghan Adjustment Act, which is first of all, I should say, AILA supports this, and we've had so many members of AILA that have helped Afghan families, have represented them, and have been frustrated that the process for getting them the kind of relief, and there are some available provisions, the special immigrant visas that Casey mentioned, there's a parole mechanism, but they just have fallen far short. And so we support the Afghan Adjustment Act because we'll provide that it urgently needed relief. What we hear is that there are concerns still that the Afghan Adjustment Act doesn't provide adequate screening for that population. And I would push back on that point, and I have to both Republican and Democratic sides of the aisle, because they will be getting the most rigorous screening ever for any population coming in at the standard that refugees receive. And I think most people know this, but I'll restate it. Refugees take years to come to the United States. They're taken through so many different stages at the international level, the UN level, as well as US screening. So I'm hoping that at least that obstacle people will not just accept at face value. And Casey, I hope you're wrong that that the politics are going to continue to stress this. There's a few comments in the chat box about support from the military perspective. I think the voice of veterans, the voice of former service members has been so critical in this debate, because I think they're the big champions for protecting the Afghan population that they served along with. One other question area that I just want to make sure we touch upon here is in this new Congress that is coming up, and we only have a few minutes left on the clock. What would you suggest for folks that are paying attention to the immigration issue, where from the outside of Congress things can be done to try to move things? And I'm going to ask you maybe each to give not only that comment, but just if there's anything else you want to sum up here, because I think this might be kind of the last word. And since we start with Monica, Monica, why don't you go first, and then we'll turn to Casey, and Casey can have close to the final word here.
Yeah, I would say, I think like I've repeated myself a lot, but again, just the urgency of the moment, I think is really important. I also, I think, would encourage, and I have been encouraging corporate partners to speak up about their workforce challenges and their need for immigration. I think I would encourage, national security allies. I think one of the issues more broadly is that, immigration, I think, can't be seen as sort of in a silo. I think immigration and immigrants and the community impacts every single part of our country. And I would encourage, I think we need a lot more voices. I also think that perhaps, even though I'm pessimistic about anything happening in the next 2 years, legislatively, perhaps people can get together and form coalitions. We call them unlikely allies, but of partners together to try to do creative solution brainstorming, so that in a couple years, hopefully we're in a position to come together in a better place. As Casey mentioned at the top, and I'll just reiterate, right, we haven't had immigration reform since 1986. And for those of us who've been doing this work for a really long time, it can be hard, hamster on a wheel. And I think at this point, I think we need to broaden coalitions and try to bring in allies from all corners and have conversations that are broader than just the narrow ones that affect the immigrant community.
Thanks, Monica. Casey?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, look, supporting people like Senator Tillis and Senator Sinema as they work to try to forge a compromise, despite, screaming from both sides saying this is not a good compromise, right? You're going to lose the far left and the far right on any compromise you find, on anything that can pass Congress, and at least the far right. Let's say that we might not lose the far left, but I think that, like, supporting people that are trying to speak up and push a different narrative. There are great members out there too. Maria Salazar in Florida has been someone who's, put a lot of work into trying to find a solution that can start forging compromise on the House side. And look, I think sometimes too, the most successful conversations are those happening in secret. Oftentimes we've made progress on these by having members who can move outside the political sphere and have honest conversations behind closed doors that get us ready for what comes next. So I think continuing to look for and support those members, and then educate. They can't overemphasize the importance of helping people understand how the system works. I held immigration 101 sessions for many members of Congress, basically saying, okay, here's how our green card system works. Here's how DACA works, right? Here's what the memo put in place. Here's the population size. Here's how it's calculated based on their date of arrival and things like that. I mean, really basic things, trying to get staff and members up to speed to be educated enough to even have a debate over very difficult issues. The more members that are educated and can speak smart about this, the more productive conversations we're going to be able to have. So that's something that I always encourage clients to be doing in times like this, where it seems like nothing can happen. The best thing you can do is get out there and help people understand what the actual issues are, how the system works, and how it might be able to be improved.
think I get a little bit of the last word here, and I'll start just by saying it's been a real pleasure to be on the panel here with both you, Monica, and Casey, having had the chance to work with you both before when you were on the Hill, and I was asking you all the time if you could do this or could do that, and frequently was, sorry, I can't talk to you, Greg, right now, and sorry, I can't do that for you, but it's great to hear your insights now as you're off the Hill. I will say as a final remark, maybe echoing a little bit, Casey, what you were saying, in terms of supporting Senators Tillis and Sinema in these negotiations. Ayla very much wants these conversations to keep happening. And to me, it doesn't matter to what degree, as people have sometimes questioned the interest or whether they trust Senators Tillis and Sinema in this process. And I've seen in the chat, people don't trust some of our members of our administration currently. Well, I would actually put to all of us and all of you here, that doesn't matter. And trust does matter, in fact, at the personal level when you are working with somebody hand in hand close on something. But as external constituents, what matters is what they produce. That's what we were looking at, and we are hoping that they will make the effort here. It's not going to be a pretty product that we can all just give a great warm embrace and kumbaya. Most likely, we are going to have to, put really hold our nose to what the parts that we don't like, and swallow that part because there's something in there that we think is absolutely necessary to take. And I think it's accurate to say that's going to be the case on the other side, whichever side that you're on. That's what we are holding kind of our fire right now in terms of openly criticizing the ideas or the politicians that are supporting this particular effort and wanting to see the bill text. We hope they do get to that stage. In the meantime, it's important to educate, as both Monica and Casey were talking about, make sure that members of Congress understand what's in there. For those of you that have the wherewithal or the interest to pick up the phone and contact your members of Congress, do that. Make sure they know the issues that are important, and also tell them why protecting DACA recipients and dreamers is important, why your business needs foreign workers. And why we need an efficient system that works for the whole country. I think those are the messages that they actually need, and especially with so many new members coming in the new year. With that, I'm going to say thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to the ABA for hosting this, to Adonia for helping organize this, and somebody you don't see named Ali, who has been helping manage all the back end of this. Great thanks to the ABA for putting on this important panel. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.